In today's video, I get it, dude. All you want to do is tow your porter slum across the best damn country on earth between New Zealand and Somalia. And that would depend on the tow ball not coming loose. I think we can all agree on that. So, why do tow balls come loose? And even more importantly, how do you prevent that? That's next. I'm John Cadogan from AutoExpert.com.au. New cars cheap, but Australia only. Website. God. Now, while I was away last week in China plotting the, overthrow of Western democracy or whatever it was we were doing over there, it's all a blur, I'm so old, I got this email from a dude named Matt, and I thought this could be good. We'll cover this off later, and here we all are then. Matt goes, John, I thought this might be an interesting one for your channel. Below is a photo of a screenshot from the Zone RV Owners Group, which I will just put over there, where an owner has decided it's a great idea to drill a hole and put a split pin to stop the nut from coming loose. I think the only loose nut here is the owner. I see what you did there, Matt. Nicely done, son. But curious to get an engineer's perspective. Well, as the most shit engineer graduating in, whatever it was, 1989 on Earth, I'm happy to oblige Matt. Matt goes on and says, there's heaps of talk in the group that as it's below the nut, there are no issues. I think there are a few issues, but not of the kind that people are commenting on Facebook. Would this be the case? Cheers, Matt. Now, the image that you are looking at is from an dude named Bob Guthrie. And Bob Guthrie's thought process is something that I find fascinating. I'm just taking it at face value, obviously. There might be more to the story than on Facebook. There often is, but just going to roll with the face value here. Bob says, after Evan said that his came loose, I've made this mod. Should be Ugga Dugga free. Smiley emoji. Men don't emoji, Bob. On the fall. Just saying. Now, as to Ugga Dugga free and making this mod, the thing that really worries me here is that seemingly Bob has read a post on Facebook from a dude he may or may not know named Evan, who said that his tow ball came loose, and this prompted Bob to trot off down the stairs or something and drill a hole in the screw of his tow ball. He hasn't experienced any loosening type problem himself, Bob, but he's done this modification anyway. And this is kind of the problem, emblematic of the problem with the beard stroking anywhere slum tourer, isn't it? You should only do modifications that you know for certain aren't going to fail on critical components, so there's that. And you should probably only modify something when you've identified a problem. If you find something that needs a solution, then by all means, engineer up something. Great, solving problems is kind of what engineers do, at least in part. But if you haven't had the problem, don't change anything because it's working fine. That's always a good policy. Now, the other point I would make just generally about, redneck engineering is that if you want to do stuff with your hands, you want to make stuff, you want to fix stuff, you want to make stuff better, I get that, approved. But you have to make a rational set of decisions, right? And the first bridge that I would suggest crossing is what's a critical component and what's a non-critical component, okay? Critical meaning, if it fails, is someone going to get injured or die? And I'd suggest that, yeah, someone is. If you modify anything to do with towing 6 tons of combination down the road at 100 k's an hour, unless you are rock solid certain that it is going to be problem free, then don't do it. Concentrate instead on something subcritical, like, I don't know, build a rocket stove or the world's best barbecue plate or furniture. I don't care. Just not something that's going to come unglued in the most high kinetic energy mayhem, people might die fashion. Jesus Christ. Have a look at that photograph pretty clearly and answer me 2 questions. Think about these 2 questions. Does it matter if you drill a hole in the thread there and fit a split pin? And B, is it going to solve the problem? Because we're going to drill down into that. And I'm also going to tell you why they come loose and how to prevent yours from ever coming loose, ever again, no matter how many corrugations you ever drive across. That's next. This report is sponsored by NordVPN. Get a huge discount plus 4 extra months of Nord for free right now in Nord's Black Friday exclusive deal. Go to nordvpn.com/AEJC. Online security threats are, of course, everywhere, but you do not have to be the next victim. And that's where NordVPN comes in, locking everything down efficiently in the background. Go to nordvpn.com/AEJC now. Every 2-year NordVPN plan receives a huge discount plus 4 bonus months on top. nordvpn.com/AEJC. Link in the description. Using NordVPN is dead easy. You just subscribe, download the app, and you connect. 1 click later, your IP address is shielded and your traffic is encrypted across as many as 6 of your devices. Nord is, of course, the fastest VPN on the planet. It costs only about as much as 1 cup of coffee every month to keep your data, your identity, and your devices secure. Masking your location means you'll be able to access streaming and other services that might be blocked where you live, plus you can continue to watch your favourite content when you travel. Go to nordvpn.com/AEJC now, boost your security, get that huge discount, and enjoy those extra 4 months completely free on every 2-year plan. It's all totally risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. That's nordvpn.com/AEJC, link in the description. Okay, so I would be the first to admit that I do not understand the attraction of taking his and hers effluent out there across the country, living in a box where you can take a dump and shower at the head of the dining table, which is also the master bedroom, with friends. Like, come on. For the cost of these combinations, like $100,000 for the vehicle and $100,000 for your 3.5-ton acoustically transparent shit, you can spend a shit ton of nights in reasonable accommodation seeing essentially exactly the same thing. So there's that. And it's much easier to get from A to B, isn't it? Much more pleasant, because having towed heavy stuff in the past is not fun. It's just something you do if you have to. Come on. But anyway, people want to do that. And even though this is a fundamental, disconnection between me and every redneck engineer towing a caravan on the planet, I think we should start with something we agree, which is that keeping your mobile slum connected to the vehicle towing it while in motion, more or less an excellent idea. Don't you agree? I think we should start there. And if the tow ball does come loose, like if the nut holding the tow ball on that tongue on the hitch comes loose, that could be bad. I mean, there are safety chains, but the potential for mayhem is much higher if that comes unglued and you go over, I don't know, a speed hump or a washaway or a culvert or a spood drain, and there's a disconnection in the forces and the hitch falls apart, and that can't be good, okay? Potential for mayhem, quite high. So how do we avoid it? WTF do you do if your tow ball keeps coming loose? Why do they come loose? And what countermeasures could we reasonably implement to stop that happening? So the Bob G redneck mod is, no ugga-duggers required. I don't know what the problem with the ugga-dugger is. It does a great job. And these things need to be tight. The problem, I think, with the thread holding the tow ball onto the tongue is essentially that it's just a lot bigger than the threads most people are used to dealing with most of the time if you're not a truck mechanic or a diesel mechanic or a heavy equipment dude like Curtis from Cutting Edge Engineering, who speaks fluent metric and banana, if memory serves. So the first point we're going to cover off is that if you've got a bolted joint, and let's just say that this is a bolted joint that does, I don't know, something, and really it's just a, you know, connection that holds a whole bunch of washers in place. How does it work? Well, the thread is, this is M20 by, I'm going to say, going out on a limb, 2.5, because I know M16 is by 2, so it'll be M20 by 2.5. I know it's M20. 2.5 is a metric course, I'm pretty sure. It's just 2 nuts, bit of high tensile gal, all thread, and bunch of galvanised washers. But let's say we need to hold that together for a reason. What happens is the nut goes up this inclined plane on these 30-degree pinnacles here, you know, the crests and the valleys of the thread. It's really just an inclined plane on a helix. So the nut slides up this inclined plane and you crank on it really, really hard with a spanner and it compresses the washers and holds them in place. And this is the basis of every high tensile bolted joint on earth. The thread in between the 2 hexes stretches, and that is resolved by compression in the thing that you want to hold together. That's how this works, okay? And I think it should be pretty obvious that we could take this contraption to the frickin' bandsaw and cut this bit of thread off here and cut this bit of thread off here, and it would make sweet FA difference to the washers, right? Because the only bit of the bolted joint doing the work is between the nuts, right? Between the nuts, so important. So that's kind of important to realise, and therefore Bob's modification is kind of insignificant in as much as it's not going to have any impact on the strength of the connection between the toe ball and the tongue, which is what you don't want to compromise. So this is kind of lucky, but I'd suggest there are redneck engineers out there right now doing stuff that they presume is okay, like this. And this is okay, but the stuff they're doing is not okay. So I'd suggest that if you don't have the training, don't play with anything critical. Get someone qualified to do that. And I'm a little bit critical of Bob's solution in any case because it doesn't help, right? It helps in as much as you can't lose the nut. I get that. If the nut comes loose, it's not going to fall off the end of the bolt. It's not going to go fall out on the road, you know, 10 Ks back there somewhere in the corrugations. But it's not going to stop the nut coming loose because there's like at least one thread. I think that photograph pretty clearly shows that the hole is at least one thread below the nut. So the cotter pin is just like a catching mechanism for a loose nut. And what we'd really want to do here is stop the freaking nut from coming loose in the first place. Because if it comes loose, it's going to rattle around and be under load, and it's going to be subjected to the nature of dynamic forces that were never in the design brief, which is bad. It could clunk for hours if you've got Celine Dion cranked up on 13 or something. So as I see it, the main flaw is that the nut can still come loose. Won't fall off, but loose is bad, as just discussed, okay? A more elegant solution might be a castellated lock nut, mightn't it? You could invert the lock nut. So the castellated bits are down, and you could tighten it up on the existing nut so that it doesn't come loose. And then you could stick a split pin, you drill a hole through the castellations and stick a split pin in place so that the castellated nut can't fall off if it comes loose. So lots of things have got to come loose before it falls off. But I'd suggest that even if that is a more elegant solution, it's still kind of bullshit, because if you do it up properly in the first place and you do it up in a professional tradesman-like manner, it's never going to come loose in the first place. So I know there's going to be a lot of discussion in Facebook groups about this and that, and engineering is going to be part of it, but why do nuts come loose in the first place? Why do bolted joints come loose? In particular, why does the one holding the toe ball to the tongue come loose? Well, there's nothing special about these particular bolted joints. They're not high-tech in any way. They're not particularly high-grade fasteners. They don't do a particularly huge job restraining loads. They're just size appropriate. And like I said earlier, the only difference for your ordinary punter who's likely to be, I don't know, sticking furniture together from IKEA or whatever, but just doing domestic house and shed kind of projects, is that you don't usually work that often, at least on fasteners that are 7/8 of an inch across, right? Threaded fasteners 7/8 of an inch in diameter, or 1.25 inches, which would be the bigger one, the 70mm one. So they're just bolted joints, and you know, tradies like fitters and machinists and engineers, mechanical engineers, spend a lot of time working on, thinking about, doing calculations around tightening up, loosening up, fixing fasteners that can't come loose, blah, 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 of that nature. There's nothing special about this, okay? This is just like an entry-level industrial-grade fastener solution thing, okay? The main reason why anything comes loose is that you didn't tighten it up appropriately in the first place. And in the case of these big fasteners, you know how when you're doing like a M10 or M12 fastener, you've got a feel for that, and you've got spanners for that at home, presumably. You know, and you've got a feel for what's tight and what's snug and what's really tight. And if it matters, you can pull out a torque wrench and get it bang on. You probably don't have a torque wrench the right size for your tow bar, like for your tow ball. And you also probably don't have the software loaded upstairs for what's snug and what's tight and what's really tight with big fasteners of this nature. So they feel a bit different, but it's only a magnitude thing. They're operating exactly the same. It's hard to get them tight enough. Most people think they've really cranked down on their wrench, whatever kind of wrench they're using, but really they're not close to being tight enough, are they, sort of thing. So the other reason that these kinds of things fall apart is they're not a set and forget proposition. You should check them from time to time, especially if you're on an expedition and you're driving every day and you've got to get from A to B. It's a really good idea to have a condition monitoring program for your frickin' caravan, right? Like you'd want to check the tyre pressures daily, and after you've driven long enough in the morning to stop for a coffee or a cup of tea or something, you'd want to stop and you'd want to put the back of your hand on all of the hubs just to see how warm they are, just in case a bearing is overheating, because the next step there, if it is, if one of them's much hotter, it's sending you a message like by telepathy, and it's saying, dude, I'm about to chop the end of the axle off and send the wheel flying into the boonies or the oncoming traffic. Might be a good time to investigate, kind of thing. And you'd want to check all this stuff, right, regularly. And I would have toe ball tightness on my list of things to check, and it's really easy to check in the field. We'll get to that. So checking them often enough really matters. And there are other contributing factors to bolted joints coming loose in service, right? They include things like paint, which you shouldn't have between, like you shouldn't have paint under the nuts in this case, or if there's a nut and a washer and then something that you're holding together, there shouldn't be any paint on the something you're holding together within the footprint of the washer. So you would want to mechanically remove that, like get there with a scraper, and if you want to do a nice neat job, just, you know, trace around the mounting flange on the toe ball on the top and the washer on the bottom and scuff it up and get rid of the paint in some way, and just have bare metal on bare metal, because that's going to work out a whole lot better, okay? Contamination and rust, same thing. Rust is bad. Any other sort of surface contamination, salt spray getting in there, or you haven't undone it for 20 years and you don't know what it's like under there, then just clean it up and get bare metal on bare metal and clamp that together. That never ends in tears, okay? The other thing is that the surface of the tongue, let's say that this bracket I'm making is the tongue, and the hole is here, then you would want to get a straight edge and just put it across the tongue like that. Like just a ruler, dude, your basic ruler. You don't have to have some metrology lab. You just get a ruler and put it across there and look for any light under there, and just put the ruler at 90 degrees to it and look for any light under there at 90 degrees. And if there's a bunch of unevenness, or it's bent because Christ knows what, someone, previous owner, backed into a brick wall or something and bent the tongue, then it might be time to get a new hitch, mightn't it? Or fix it in some other way, because it's better if what you're clamping down onto is as flat as the flanges and the washers that you're mating it to. If it's not flat, it could flex. If you don't do it up tight enough and then the nut just keeps coming loose, that's bad. Vibration, okay? These other factors, you can mitigate that. Vibration with this application, not so much, because you're going to be driving over corrugation. But I would suggest, seriously suggest, that although vibrations, corrugations, whatever, feel bad to the human inside the vehicle, it's not really high-level vibration by the time you get to the tow bar, because that vibration is attenuated by the suspension and the tyres, right? By the time the vibration gets to the tow bar, it's not that significant. And I don't think that normal dirt road, corrugated road, whatever, driving is a significant factor when you weigh up exactly the loads that are inside the fastener when it's done up appropriately. So I think the main problem here is people just not doing that nut up tight enough. We'll get to that. So just for complete disambiguation, when you look at Bob's redneck fix, okay, that's a particular kind of tow hitch called a Cruisemaster D035, and there are D045s as well. There's a bunch of them. Okay, you could look them up, but it's a US specific type of off-road coupling, and it's not as common here as the traditional towball. So I want to spend the next bit of this video making it as relevant as possible to as many people out there on the road getting ready for the outback adventure in the cooler months in Australia over, preparation for the next few months and then going out and doing it sort of May, June, July, August kind of thing. The common tow balls are 50 millimetres and 70, right? 50 for up to 3.5 tonnes and 70 for over 3.5 tonnes if memory serves. The usual threads that you see on those fasteners are 7/8 14 UNF and 1 1/4 12 UNF. Now, that's the diameter across the flats here, okay? 7/8 or 1 1/4. This is the number of threads per inch, 14 in the case of the smaller one and 12 in the case of the big one. And UNF just means the fine version of that imperial thread. There's UNCs for coarse. This is metric coarse, M20 by 2.5. The difference between metric and imperial is that metric threads specify the difference in distance between the peaks of adjacent threads, whereas imperial threads talk about the number of threads per inch, in this case 14 and in this case 12. But you don't really have to worry about the engineering of all of that. You just need to know what they are, because then you can look them up in tables and get more information about how they work and make some intelligent engineering interpolations, if you like, which is what we're going to do now. So if you're going to buy a tow ball, it's important to buy the right size, either 50 or 70, depending on the trailer. And so many people do this, I think. If you've got a $100,000 vehicle and a $100,000 anywhere slum and you put them together, that's a $200,000 investment. And how many people do you reckon are out there doing that and towing with some $30 Temu frickin' tow ball? I reckon more than is sensible. Anyway, the best material, my personal preference for materials for tow balls would be 4140 steel. It's chrome moly, basically. It's got chromium, molybdenum and manganese in it, and its main party trick, its superpower, is toughness. It's tough even in its normalised state. I mean, you can harden it, you can quench harden it, but hardness and tow balls don't go together. You'd want a normalised 4140 tow ball. It's the best material. You could build it out of 1080 or 1045, I think, as well, but 4140 is very nice. And if you machine it properly, it looks pretty cool too. So anyway, you would want a tow ball that is standard compliant. And I'm not sure if the Australian standard is recommended or mandatory in the case of tow balls, but either way, you'd want that. It's AS 4177, and there's an ADR for the coupling between vehicles of this nature. It's 6202, and you'd want evidence from the manufacturer that the tow ball complies with both of those standards. At least I would want that if I was going to do that, which I never would. Although I've got tow balls on both of my vehicles, and I have used them for towing of this and that, not caravans, not once, not ever. Euthanize me if I ever fantasize about it, please. But they're 4140, okay? It's a nice material, they're standards compliant. I'd also want the manufacturer to supply their recommended torque spec, because if they've gone to the trouble of standards compliance like this, then sure as shit they would know how hard to do it up. And then you'd have a target to aim for. Or you could even go to a truck or a bus mechanic and say, hey, please tighten this up to whatever it is, 500 Newton meters or something. Sorry about the jump cut then, a courier just came to the door. Now, the torque spec, okay, they would work that out. You'd want also a batch number, ideally, because then they've got tracking, right? It'd be engraved presumably on the bottom of the thread or somewhere else that is insignificant from a stress riser point of view, but is trackable, so that if there were a problem, they could recall it, right? And you could identify which batch it came from. So all that takes is month and year of manufacturer. That'd probably be close enough for most fault tracking kind of mechanisms. And you'd want an Australian manufacturer, because you don't want to be on the chat to Shanghai or something if there's a problem with your tow ball, particularly if it leads to a big problem with decoupling and mayhem, which might involve insurance companies and lawyers at 20 paces. You'd want to be dealing with an Aussie manufacturer, right? And the example that I came up with pretty quickly, because I guess they did their SEO properly, is a company in Queensland, I think, called Couplemate. And they do all kinds of tow balls, and they basically tick every one of these boxes. You've got your standards compliance and your good material and your tracking and a torque spec. So let's talk about that. So one of the things I'm aware of off the top of my head is that 4140 is a very similar material to grade 5 Imperial high tensile fasteners. It's about 25% lower in terms of things like assembly torque and failure stress and all of those kinds of things that really matter. But the point is that all fastener manufacturers make fasteners to a grade 5 specification. You can look at all of that and you can infer information about the performance of a 4140 tow ball. Okay, and that means you can contextualize how these things actually perform, how hard you need to tighten them up, and things of that nature. And frankly, if you've got a cheap, shitty tow ball, now would be the time just to whip out and undo it, put it in the recycling bin, and get a decent one, because cheap tow ball, just the thought of cheap tow ball just makes my head explode. So here's the way materials basically work and how it relates to threaded fastener design, right? You've got this thing, it's called the ultimate tensile strength. And in the case of a grade 5 fastener, it's 827 megapascals. That's only true for a 1/4 inch to 1 inch, I think. After 1 inch, they knock it back a bit in terms of its ultimate tensile strength. But anyway, don't worry about that. It's the principle that matters here, so don't get bogged down in the details. And if you don't speak megapascals, two things on that. The first thing is megapascals are really newtons per square millimetre, and a newton is roughly 100 grams of force. So every 100 grams of force spread over 1 square millimetre of cross-sectional area is 1 megapascal, megapascal and megapascal. So Pascal, named after the pressure dude from France, okay? So 827 of those is 827 newtons spread over 1 square millimetre, which is about 80 kilograms over 1 square millimetre, which is one person hanging from a wire, cross-sectional area of which is 1 square millimetre, okay? That's how that works, but even if you don't want to go down that track of figuring out how to put megapascals in perspective, that's what it is, but it's really just relative numbers, okay? Steel's pretty strong stuff. 4140 is pretty strong. It's not quite as strong as this. It's about 25% less. They're just numbers. It's a scale. So you've got the ultimate tensile strength, then you've got the yield strength, which is like if you've got a piece of steel, some random piece of steel, and you bend it a little bit, it'll spring back into shape and be elastic. But if you bend it a bit more, it's going to bend permanently, and part of that deformation is going to be what they call plastic, like permanent. And the point at which elastic transpires over to plastic deformation is the yield point, right? There's just a point in stress where that happens. So that's 634, so it's about knock 25% off, and that's when it starts to deform permanently. Okay, and then you've got a thing called a proof load, which is what they test the bolts to, which is about 85-ish% of the yield stress. And then you've got an assembly torque, which is the one you look up in the manual, right? And it's about less than half of when it breaks. So if you want to contextualize what these things all mean, the ultimate tensile strength is when it breaks. That's when you plunge to your death, when the cable breaks, kind of thing. You put a fastener in the bin when it yields, okay, because then it's sort of stretched permanently and it's no good anymore, and it won't be as strong next time, kind of thing. Now, the ghetto test for this, which is really, really important to know, is you get your toe ball and you undo it and you pull it out of the tongue, and then you get the nut and you run it by hand all the way up the thread. And if it runs seamlessly up the thread to the point where the thread ends, good to go. It hasn't yielded yet. But if you get to some point just past where it would traditionally be done up to, and it doesn't go anymore, and there's not just something blocking the thread, if the thread seems clean, you clean it up with a wire brush or something, and it still won't go, then it's a throwaway because it's yielded, okay? The proof load is just a standardized test thing. They batch test bolts when they manufacture them. They load them up to the proof load and hey, it's all good. And the assembly torque is like 65% of the proof load typically, okay? So what this means is this is all like a safety margin above the assembly. It's like 54% more to the proof load, right, from 380 to 586, and then it's 66% more up to the yield stress, and then it's more than double to break. Okay, so you've got all of this safety margin here in the design of the bolt. The assembly torque is designed to give you sufficient stretch of the bolt to clamp the piece so that it does the job, right? But also so that you're not going to get anywhere near the point where the fastener is a throwaway or, heaven forbid, it breaks, okay? Because when anything breaks and it matters, people might die or get terribly injured, and that's generally to be avoided, okay? So this is a very well thought out engineering system where you get sufficient clamping force but you don't get anywhere near breaking it or ruining it. If you just maintain the correct assembly torque, it doesn't come loose, and it can be used indefinitely. It can be disassembled and reassembled any number of times, and the fastener is always as good as day one, provided, you know, it's not corroded or things of that nature, okay? So that's kind of how this works, and what you need to achieve with your toe ball is an assembly torque like that, tight enough so it doesn't come loose, sufficiently far away from these 2 points of quote-unquote failure. So I just looked up the assembly torques for the 7/8 and the 1 1/4 UNF threads, and basically the assembly torque is 410 foot-pounds, which is about, I only ballpark that, it's about 530 Newton meters. And you don't have to get these things precise because there's already so much inaccuracy with using a torque wrench that it doesn't matter if you're, if you're 5, 10, 15, 20 Newton meters out in this range of 500 Newton meters, it won't make any difference. You're not going to be this accurate in any case. 530, close enough. The clamping force corresponding to this assembly torque is 28,000 pounds force, which is heaps, right? It's 125 kilonewtons or 12.5 tons. And this is for the small one. The 50 millimeter ball has a clamping force of 12.5 tons when you do it up to that, if it's a grade 5 fastener. Now, on the Couplemate spec sheet, the business that makes the tracking and standards compliant 4140 tow balls I mentioned earlier, and I'm sure there's others. I have no relationship with them. I've only looked up their data online, right? But they've obviously spent a lot of money doing the standards compliance and getting it right. So they've got an assembly torque of about 370 Newton meters, which is roughly kind of thing 25% lower. So you'd expect 25% less clamping force, all other things being equal. So we're talking about 10 tons kind of thing, right? 10 tons is a lot of clamping force. Okay, and obviously you'd expect the bigger one to deliver more in every respect. The same analysis there is 1,400 Newton meters for the grade 5 fastener worth of assembly torque, corresponding to about 22 tons. The Couplemate spec is about 1,100 Newton meters, so it's ballpark about the same, 25-30% less. So you'd expect this to be 15-ish tons of clamping force with your 70 mil tow ball. And the problem there, of course, is how do you achieve that? How do you achieve that with your tow bar installation when you first get it? And how do you ensure that you maintain that tension in the field when you're doing your big lap of Australia or something of that nature? And what do you do if your tow ball comes loose? If you're walking around the car and you're checking everything and there's a bit of play in the tow ball nut, what do you do? What do you do in the field when you're a million miles from anywhere in the boonies? Well, we'll deal with all of these in order. So what I would suggest is you get a reliable tow ball installer, tow bar installer, to install the tow ball for you, and you make sure that they comply with the recommended assembly torque for that tow ball, and it shouldn't come loose. It's as simple as that. They should have equipment on site that allows them to torque something up to 368 or 1,100 Newton meters, whatever it is. Whatever that torque spec is, they should have a torque wrench that does that, okay? And if they don't, you'd have to say, do I really want to do business with this person, okay? The next thing you need to know is if you're going to change your tow ball because it's 25 years old and it's scored and rusted and maybe you could buy a better one, then get the person who fits the tow ball to do exactly that. So take it to a diesel mechanic, a truck mechanic, a bus mechanic, someone of that nature, or a tow bar installer, and watch them like a hawk when they do it and make sure they do this. And a good tradie doing this should have absolutely no problem with showing you that it's on the money. And if they don't want to show you that, then you have to ask yourself, do I really want to do that? This should be like a very cheap job too, because you're bringing a tow ball and a hitch to a business, and all they have to do is walk outside with a torque wrench, or if you just bring the hitch in, all they have to do is put it in a vise and get the right socket and go click, right? Not that hard, not that expensive, and you know it's right. All of this, do it in the driveway business with a 1 meter breaker bar and all of this stuff. Who has time, okay? The one thing you've got to be able to do though is check it in the field and fix it in the field if you're in the boonies. So how do you do that? I would suggest that you need the right wrench. And the right wrench could be a 3/4 drive. You'd want to get a 3/4 drive breaker bar, medium quality. You don't need snap-on because you're not going to use it every day, right? You're going to use it occasionally and you're not going to use it that hard, and therefore medium quality is fine. And you want the right socket. Now, this is a 12-point socket, but I would argue that a 6-point socket is ideal for jobs of this nature, or more ideal, because at high loads they're less likely to slip. And I would just put this somewhere in a toolbox and use it once every few days. If I'm driving on a corrugated road, just check it, just manually check it, just get it there on that nut and pull it towards you, and if it is rock solid, then there is no need to worry, right? That's all you need, but you probably don't even need to invest quite this much, because I just measured the flats on the 50mm toe ball that I've got, and if you want to do that, get yourself a pair of medium quality vernier calipers like this, and just, they're right-handed obviously, so, and I'm a lefty, so just whip them out and measure across the flats, and if it's 32 point, I don't know, 6 like mine are, then you'd want a 33mm wrench. And I'd just get one of these, right? A 33mm Renegade Industrial or Force wrench. And in fact, I prefer the Force ones, and I just looked it up at tradetools.com, $30. This is all you need for in the field, right? And well, it's not all you need, but it's the only wrench you need to do this job. And $30, like dirt cheap. These are reasonably high quality wrenches. The Force ones are made in Taiwan, so they're about here on the quality scale. Snap-on's about here, Force is about here, but good enough for Curtis at Cutting Edge Engineering. He uses a lot of Force tools. Check it out, dude. These are Renegades, so they're about here, but they're close, right? But made in China. They'd all be okay. The Force one, I found it first, $30. So great, okay? And then get yourself some form of hammer. My favourite hammer for doing this kind of job is the copper-faced hammer, because it doesn't damage anything made of steel that you hit. Now, I just looked these up on Trade Tools. This is a 4-pound one, but I'd recommend a 3-pound one. Thanks very much, Garbos. The Garbo always comes when I'm shooting a package. They come on Thursday. They can come at 5 o'clock in the morning. If I'm shooting a package at 5, they come at 5. If I'm shooting a package at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, they come at 1. How do they know? Quantum entanglement, I'm tipping. Anyway, get yourself a nice copper hammer. A 3-pound one's going to cost you about $90, okay? And all you do is you put the ring end on the wrench, give it a good solid tap. That'll get you to the next truck mechanic, bus mechanic, diesel mechanic, whatever. And then they can do it up properly. This is the best way to tighten something up when you don't have a 1 metre long wrench. And let's not forget that 400 Newton metres is about 40 kilos at the end of 1 metre. That's a big tug, so to speak. It really is. Like, that's kind of hard to do in the dust. You know what I mean? And you're not going to get it close. It's half your body weight being pulled horizontally at the same level as your knees on the end of a 1 metre breaker bar. So you'd need this, right? And a piece of pipe 1 metre long, and the pipe snugged up here, and 40 kilos on the end of it. So that's already somewhat inelegant, I would argue, whereas getting a wrench and hitting it with a hammer like this is a beautiful thing. And a lot of non-tradies would say, oh, you butcher, right? The butcher of everything mechanical is hitting a wrench with a hammer, but au contraire. It's the best way to undo a super resistant to it being undone fastener. And it's also a great way to snug something significant up when you just don't have a torque wrench 2 metres long, okay? This approach will get you out of trouble in the boonies. It'll be tight enough, okay? You can drive for, I don't know, give it a couple of hits, a couple of decent hits on the, you know, the open end with the ring end engaged properly with the nut, okay? And then drive for a couple of hours and just feel how it's going, right? And if it's good for a couple of hours, check it that evening. And if it's still okay, then good enough, right? And look, the one final thing I would suggest you get in order to do this properly is it can be a problem if the toe ball spins, right? If you're cranking on the nut and the toe ball is just spinning because there's nothing restraining it from spinning, right? There's just friction under the flange of the toe ball. And sometimes that's insufficient to get enough purchase to do up the vital last few tens or hundreds of Newton meters. So in that case, get yourself a pair of sort of channel lock pliers, you know, vice grips, whatever you want to call them. Not vice grips, like multi-grips, yeah. Slip joint pliers, whatever. These aren't slip joint though, they've got a little thumb activated pawl. But anyway, and what I'd suggest you do there is, you can do it yourself, or you can get a whole lot of Rosie to lean on it the other way with a 42, 39, 56, you know. She's going to pull on the, you want to grab the flange of the toe ball. Do not put anything rough on the ball itself. Get these across the flange of the toe ball, just on top of the tongue. Rosie's going to 42, 39, 56 it in a clockwise sense, looking down on top. And then you're going to come in from the rear. And you're going to be pulling counterclockwise like this. Or even better, just get Rosie to snug it up and get ready, prepare for impact, brace for impact, and then just give it a couple of good taps with your copper hammer. Now, I realise copper hammers are somewhat expensive, but they're also really good in the workshop because you can hit all manner of things with them made of steel and they don't damage it. They're really good for persuading pins to come out when they've been in service for, you know, years in the rust and all of that stuff. So if you buy one soft-faced hammer and just chuck it in your toolbox when you go touring, it'll come in pretty handy for that, but it's not as if it doesn't have 1,000 uses at home also. These are really good. They're one of my favourite tools. I've got a heap of soft-face hammers. I use them all the time. In fact, I hardly ever use a steel hammer except for nailing, if I've ever got to, you know, go to battle with a piece of wood. The soft-face hammer is so useful, and yet so many DIYers don't have them. You can get these wrenches in all kinds of sizes. I just whipped out a lazy 46 here. Next time I'm attacked by Optimus Prime, I'll just, you know, whip his leg off with a 46mm wrench. But they're not that expensive anymore, and you can be properly tooled up to deal with this problem. You don't have to do any redneck engineering bullshit that's, you know, largely ineffective in any case. Drilling holes in things that really were never designed to have holes drilled in them, and which you might have to go to battle against your insurance company with if there was ever some sort of hideous problem. Even though, you know, I suspect you would win, you'd probably have to hire a consultant engineer who would write you a report and say, no, that didn't actually cause that failure. But that might cost you a couple of $1,000 that you need not otherwise spend. So anyway, I hope if you are not a hands-on, lifelong user of tools or worked in heavy industry or any of that stuff, that this has given you some insight into how that joint between the toe ball and the tongue actually works, and even better, how you can implement countermeasures to stop it being problematic in the field. Definitely test it regularly, maybe not every day, but every few days. You know, just make sure it's not loose, and then it's not going to come loose, and, you know, you can go on and design that world's best barbecue plate or rocket stove and not fuck about with anything critical. Just leave everything critical alone and do cool stuff where lives are not in the balance.